Hello and welcome everyone to Walt Disney Presents. Today we will be continuing with Walt Disney and American Original, Section 4, Chapter 22. Television proved its power to attract wider audiences for Disney films. Both 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Lady and the Tramp were immensely successful. At last, the company no longer had to live from one picture to the next. Also, the effectiveness of television as a selling medium permitted a wider range of story material for cartoon features. Formerly, Walt relied on universally known fairy tales for immediate audience recognition. He demonstrated with Lady and the Tramp that television could acquaint the public with entirely original plots and characters. The movie profits added to the financial health of Walt Disney Productions, but they were not enough to accomplish the financing of Disneyland. The company sent emissaries to major corporations seeking participation in advance payments. Some sparked the promise of Disneyland and paid to have their corporate names associated with the park. Others did not. Roy Disney and Larry Tryon, the company treasurer, made repeated visits to the downtown Los Angeles headquarters of the Bank of America to plead for new transfusions of funds to meet the Disneyland needs. Al Howe, who had succeeded Joe Rosenberg as the bank's liaison with Disney, was sympathetic to the project, but the Bank of America had no experience in financing amusement parks. The nation's unsettled economy in 1954 added to the bank's reluctance to continue pouring funds into Disneyland. As the budget rose from $7 million to $11 million, Bank of America enlisted the Bankers Trust Company of New York to take a shared participation in the Disneyland loan. To some of the bankers, Walt seemed profligate. You can't put a price tag on creativity, he argued. That had been his theory from the beginning. He refused to make his cartoons on a strict budget because he wanted them to be better. Making them better meant spending more money. When Roy argued that payments from distributors were not enough to cover production costs, Walt's answer was, if we make cartoons, we'll get more money next time. If we make better cartoons, we'll get more money next time. He was unable to establish budgets for Snow White, Fantasia, and Bambi and other cartoon features because he was pioneering with new mediums, new techniques. The same with Disneyland. He set no budgetary limits on his planners and engineers. They were exploring unknown territory, and only at the end of the quest would Walt know what it cost. In December 1954, Joe Fowler concluded that he could no longer get woodwork done outside the park with the speed and quality Walt demanded. Fowler proposed immediate construction of the Town Square Opera House so it could enclose the mill. The cost would be $40,000. Gee, Joe, I just don't have the money, Disney told Fowler, explaining that he had exhausted all possibilities for additional financing. But when Fowler returned the following day, Roy told him, yes, I've got your money, go ahead. Walt never doubted that his brother would find the money to build Disneyland. Walt's principal concern was meeting the impossible deadline that he had set for himself. By January 1st, 1955, it seemed imperative that some compromises had to be made. Tomorrowland was the least developed section of Disneyland. Walt agreed to his staff's suggestion to board up Tomorrowland with an attractive fence, announcing that it would open later. No sooner was the decision made than Walt rescinded it. We'll open the whole park, he told his staff. Do the best you can with Tomorrowland and we'll fix it up after we open. The wed planners were working 48 hours a week, and Walt was with them every day, including Saturday. The studio commissary was closed on Saturday, so the group went to a nearby tea room for lunch. The talk was about Disneyland. Walt applied his concept to everything, from the overall philosophy of the park to the details of woodwork and landscaping. Nothing eluded his view, even the trash cans. He wanted them to be attractive additions to the decor, not utilitarian eyesores. Hence, each was decorated to fit its location. Those in Frontierland were done in rustic style, etc. At times, it seemed that Walt was asked more than human ingenuity could provide. When the wed craftsman told him, we can't make it work, he replied. You guys are too close to the thing. Let's approach it from a different angle. Maybe we can restage this show and make it work. He refused to compromise. Veteran operators of amusement parks viewed his plans and pointed out that the town square at the entrance to Disneyland would be wasteful. Too much expense and space was being used in an area that would contribute little revenue. Walt listened to them and made no change. He intended the town square to set the mood for visitors. It would be a place with flowers and balloons, costumes, and a brass band. Handsomely wrought surreys, a fire wagon, and a horse-drawn trolley would take people down Main Street and to the rest of the realms. The vehicles would not have enough capacity to make a profit, but they contributed to the entire experience. Walt insisted on fine furnishing for the restaurants, even though they would be serving reasonably priced meals. He believed that if a family sat under a $50,000 chandelier and ate good food at a fair price, the experience would add to their enjoyment of the park. After working with movie sets at the studio, Walt had to accustom himself to the need for solidity in the Disneyland buildings. One day, Walt came across a large mound covered by a tarpaulin. He looked underneath and saw hundreds of bags of cement. "What's all this?" he asked of Robert Bud Washoe, another art director recruited from 20th Century Fox for construction of Disneyland. Washoe anticipated a shortage because of the construction of a huge military airport runway in Orange County. Walt grumbled. He scowled as he watched the first pourings of cement for the foundations of the Main Street buildings. John Wise, structural engineer for WED, had specified concrete pads 4 feet square, considering them the minimum for such construction. Walt thought it profligate. "Wise is wasting all my money underground," he complained to Dick Irvine. Irvine argued the need for sturdy foundations to withstand the impact of millions of patrons. Walt greedily absorbed everything the engineers told him and soon could read mechanical drawings like an expert. Sometimes the engineers told him that effects he could easily accomplish in motion pictures were impractical in an amusement park. They learned not to say that to Walt Disney. To an engineer who pointed out the possibility of a Disney proposal, Walt replied, "You know better than to kill an idea without giving it a chance to live. We set our sights high. That's why we accomplished so many things. No, go back and try it again." Those who worked closely with Walt learned never to say, "This can't be done." The right response was, "Well, Walt, this might be difficult because..." If an engineer exhausted every possibility and could not find a solution, Walt accepted the fact that it couldn't be done. Problems arose with the Orange County building inspectors. They had no experience with a place such as Disneyland. If they had applied normal building codes, construction of the park would have been exorbitant. The standards for a high-rise office building did not apply to the Sleeping Beauty castle. Disney engineers explained their methods and their good intentions, and in most cases, the inspectors were understanding. They were reassured of Disney's concern for safety when he installed automatic sprinklers in all the public buildings. Not only did the sprinklers ensure safety, they also permitted the use of materials that might otherwise have been considered a fire hazard. The engineers argued that a water tower was needed to supply pressure for the sprinklers and fire hydrants. When an engineer tried to argue the absolute necessity of the water tower, Walt almost ejected him bodily from the office. He refused to have the ugly tank towering over Disneyland. "Find another solution," he insisted, and the engineers did. Water was piped in from more than one source, assuring an unchanging pressure. That cost extra money. So did the relocation of power lines on nearby properties. But Walt wanted no intrusion on the illusion he was conjuring. Members of the park staff urged him to build an administration building. "No," he replied, "there isn't going to be any administration building. The public isn't coming here to see an administration building. Besides, I don't want you guys sitting behind desks. I want you out in the park, watching what people are doing and finding out how you can make the place more enjoyable for them." When Joe Fowler proposed a dry dock for the rivers of America, Walt opposed it. He argued that it would be unattractive and would add nothing to the customer enjoyment. Fowler, with his Navy training, realized that a dry dock was necessary for maintenance of the big boats, and he argued persuasively. During the building stage, Walt referred to it derisively as Joe's Ditch. Later, he turned the dry dock into an asset by building a picturesque fish restaurant next to it. He named the dry dock Fowler's Harbor and called the restaurant Mary's Lobster House after Fowler's wife. One of Walt's great concerns was trees. He wanted trees to be part of the beauty and the drama of Disneyland and play their roles. They needed to be big. Bill Evans hunted throughout Los Angeles and Orange County to find specimen trees, scouting new subdivisions and freeway routes for trees that were to be removed. Walt sometimes accompanied Evans to inspect trees under consideration for Disneyland. Walt wanted each tree to fit its location. Maples, sycamores, and birches for the rivers of America. Pines and oaks for Frontierland. He sometimes rejected a tree with the comment, "It's out of character." During an inspection tour of Nature's Wonderland, he rode the mine train, ordering it stop from time to time so he could observe the vista. At one point, he said, "Move all those trees back 50 feet. I want the people on the big trains to see what's going on in here. Those trees keep it hidden from them." Always he wanted the trees bigger, despite the high costs of excavating and transporting them. One day, Bill Evans found 2 trees that he was certain would impress the boss. He proudly exhibited them to Walt. "Where do you get the bushes, Bill?" Walt cracked. A staff member once questioned why Walt wanted big trees, since the buildings were scaled down to less than real size. "Trees have no scale," Walt replied flatly. Walt rejected a design for a building with the comment, I think the fellow was attempting a monument to himself rather than designing something that is for people. He impressed on his designers again and again that he wasn't seeking architectural masterpieces. All I want you to think about, he told one of them, is that when people walk through or ride through or have access to anything that you design, I want them, when they leave, to have smiles on their faces. Just remember that. It's all I ask of you as a designer. Sometimes he did the designing himself. Marv Davis had labored over the contours of Tom Sawyer Island, but his efforts failed to please Walt. Give me that thing, Walt said. That night he worked for hours in his red barn workshop. The next morning he laid tracing paper on Davis's desk and said, Now that's the way it should be. The island was built according to his design. The railroad, of course, was a special interest of Walt's. In the early stages of Disneyland, he considered buying an existing railroad from a hobbyist in Northern California. But he wanted the railroad, like everything else in Disneyland, to be fresh and new and his own. Hell, we built a train before, he told Roger Broggie of the Studio Machine Shop. We can do it again. The experience with the Carrollwood Pacific made the railroad one of the easiest projects at Disneyland. The Carrollwood Pacific locomotive, the Lily Bell, was a standard gauge engine reduced to 1/8 of full size. By multiplying its dimensions 5 times, Broggie arrived at an engine which was 5/8 normal with a 36-inch gauge standard for narrow gauge trains. The cab was slightly enlarged to accommodate the engineer. The engine and cars were built at the studio, and the railroad was one of the first Disneyland features to be completed. The dark rides were also assembled at the studio. The talents of animators contributed to devising the stunts and the visual effects of the Snow White, Peter Pan, and Mr. Toad's rides. Mock-ups were laid out in a tin-roof shed so the planners could visualize space relationships. Other dark rides of amusement parks had steel wheels on their cars, but Walt considered them too noisy. We're trying to tell a story in those rides. We need quiet cars, he said. He hired the Aero Development Company to design a car that was both silent and highly maneuverable. Walt visited the tin shed every day to see how the rides were progressing. His favorite was the Peter Pan because it was an entirely new concept. A fly-through with cars suspended from the ceilings. As the rides came closer to completion, Walt himself rode them over and over again. Bob Matty, who did the experimental work, and Roger Broggie, who completed the jobs, could always recognize Walt's reaction. If he was pleased, he got off the ride with a childlike giggle. If something went wrong, the eyebrow shot up and he muttered, Fix this thing, let's get this show on the road. Walt sought expert advice during the development stage. Dave Bradley ran a little amusement park where Walt had taken his daughters, and Walt invited him to comment on the new rides. Friendly help was also provided by George Whitney, who operated an amusement park in San Francisco. Walt listened to their suggestions, accepted some, rejected others. Whitney argued that the elevated railroad station at the park entrance was a mistake. People won't walk up to the train, he contended. But Walt believed that the Main Street train station performed a vital function as marquee for the park. Without elevation, it would have no significance. The people were uppermost in his consideration. When an attraction pleased him, he said, I think they'll go for this, or they're going to eat this up. His expression of rejection were, that's not good enough for them, or they'll expect something better. He would not sell them short. Walt commissioned Owen Pope to construct 2 Conestoga-covered wagons, 3 Yellowstones, 2 single-seat and 2 double-seat Surreys, and 3 pugboards for use in the park. Walt was unhearing of arguments that such rides would be too limited in capacity. He wanted them to lend authenticity and atmosphere to Main Street and Frontierland. He also discarded contentions that vehicles would be vandalized. Don't worry about it, he replied. Just make them beautiful and you'll appear to the best size of people. They all have it. All you have to do is bring it out. Walt visited the Anaheim site during all phases of construction. He viewed the stakeouts, the plotting of buildings sized by stakes and strings. He made his suggestions as to size and proportions, always keeping the overall pattern in mind. Often he squatted down and commented, Can you see little kids looking up at this? Most of his planners had never considered looking at the park from the vantage point of a child. The Disney vision was clear. Scale meant everything, whether it was the fairy tale size of the railroad or the nostalgic foreshortening of Main Street or the romanticism of Frontierland. It's too heavy, he complained of the scale of Frontierland. His engineers explained that it was possible to make slim supports in irons and steel, but wood poles and fences had to be thick in order to support the weight. Walt wasn't satisfied. He replaced fences and poles with others that were thin and light, yet strong. Everything had its proportion. The steamboat, the Mark Twain, had to seem as impressive as a Mississippi River paddleboat wheeler, yet it had to fit the scale of the Disneyland waterway. If the boat had been entirely scaled down, railings would have been at people's knees. The scale had to be adjusted to please the eye and remain functional. Walt approved the plans, and he ordered a scale model so he could judge the Mark Twain's appearance. The superstructure was assembled at the studio and trucked one deck at a time to Anaheim. There it was assembled on the hull. The Mark Twain's hull was constructed at the Todd Shipyard in Long Beach. Nearly everything else was built by the various departments at the Disney studio. Almost from the beginning, Walt had designed the studio to be self-sufficient. In the early days, he established a laboratory to make black and white paint so that the cartoons would have a uniform quality. When color film arrived, the studio had its own lab for making color paints. The Disney Sound Department created the multiphonic sound system for Fantasia, and the machine shop perfected underwater cameras for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. All of the departments were accustomed to dealing with the challenges that Walt gave them. When Walt wanted realistic hippos and giraffes for the Jungle Cruise, he knew his experts could provide them. Over the years, he had learned the talents of his staff, including their hobbies. Animators who sculpted in their off hours were assigned to create scale models. When the time came to fill the rivers of America, Disneyland engineers explained they would need a special pump to move the water from wells. "No, just kind of flume to the river and turn the water on," Walt said. The engineers displayed their maps and pointed out that the water would have to travel uphill to reach the river. Walt insisted that they try it his way. To the amazement of the engineers, the water did flow as he had predicted. They didn't realize that a year before, Walt had visited the property when it was still an orange grove. He had questioned the growers about planting, pruning, fertilizing, and irrigating. He remembered how the water flowed. The surveyor's maps were wrong. Water poured into the rivers of America and then disappeared. The thirsty Orange County soil absorbed it all, and engineers searched for a way to hold the water above ground. They tried plastic liners and other substances, but nothing seemed to work. "Keep trying, you'll find something," Walt told them. Finally, they located a clay soil nearby, and an inch layer on the waterway formed a pad as hard as cement. The day-to-day operation of Disneyland occupied the thinking of Disney executives, and they reported to Walt that their choice for management of the park had been narrowed to two companies. "What do we need them for?" he asked. "To run the park," an executive replied. "We have no experience in running an amusement park." "In the first place," said Walt, "this is not an amusement park. In the second place, we can run Disneyland as well as anyone. All you need are people who are eager, energetic, friendly, and willing to learn. They'll make mistakes, but we can learn from their mistakes." By late spring, Disneyland seemed far from completion. Joe Fowler assured Walt that the July opening would be achieved, but then the Orange County plumbers and asphalt workers went on strike. C.V. Wood, Disneyland general manager, told Fowler, "We might as well postpone until September. We're not going to make it by July." "Woody, we have to make it," Fowler replied. He knew how urgently the Disneys needed the summer business to start paying off their enormous debt. Besides, Fowler had been accustomed to meeting impossible deadlines. During the war, he had supervised 25 shipyards. The plumbers returned to work after Fowler guaranteed them the same payment they would receive upon settlement of the strike. The asphalt situation was solved by hauling truckloads from San Diego at an immense cost. With the July 17th opening approaching, money was getting scarce. The trees and shrubs which Bill Evans brought to the park became smaller as his budget shrank. By the time he reached his last landscaping task on the northern side of the berm, no money was left. "I'll tell you what to do, Bill," said Walt. "You know all those fancy Latin names for plants? Why don't you go down there and put some Latin names on those weeds?" Tomorrowland remained the least finished area. "Cover it up with balloons and pennants," Walt said. To stage the pageantry for opening day and to supervise entertainment after the park opened, Walt hired Tommy Walker, who had achieved fame as both leader of the marching band and football conversion kicker for the University of Southern California. "If you have one idea in 100 that works, I'll be satisfied," Walt told him. Among Walker's ideas for opening was the release of hundreds of homing pigeons. Walker explained to Walt that 10 days before the opening, the pigeons would be released halfway between Los Angeles and Disneyland. Thus, the birds could familiarize themselves with the half of the route home. When the pigeon owners assembled at the halfway point early one morning, Walt was there. He interrogated the owners about the birds' habits, and later he developed a television feature about pigeon raising. One of Walker's assignments was to hire a leader for the band which would march down Main Street and play concert at various locations in Disneyland. Walker avoided consideration of his father, Vesey Walker, a one-time Army bandmaster who organized 30 high school bands. Damn it, Tommy, I want you to hire the people who are most qualified, Walt grumbled. The elder Walker became a familiar figure with his elegant leadership of the Disneyland band. Now, Vici, Walt instructed him with his habitual mispronunciation, I just want you to remember one thing. If the people can't go away whistling it, don't play it. During the final days of construction, the Disney studio received a letter from a mother in an eastern state. Her 7-year-old son had been stricken with leukemia and he had expressed a desire to do two things: to meet the comedian Pinky Lee and to ride on Walt Disney's train. The family had already left for California hoping to fulfill the boy's wishes. When the family called the studio, they were told to report to Disneyland on Saturday morning. They arrived in their road-weary automobile, and Walt drove up shortly afterwards. I understand you want to see my train. Well, let's go, Walt said, lifting the boy into his arms and striding off to where cranes were transferring the railroad cars from flatbed trucks to the rails. When the train was assembled and the engine fired up, Walt took the boy to the cab. It was the first trip around the park for the Santa Fe and Disneyland Railway, and Walt pointed out the attractions that were still being built. When he returned to the administration building, he went to his car for a package. It was one of the 2 gold-framed pictures that had been made from artwork of Lady and the Tramp. The other had been sent to Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier of Monaco as a wedding gift. He gave the package to the boy. Well, we really saw the place. He liked my train, Walt said to the parents. To a Disneyland employee, Bob Janey, who had witnessed the visit, he gave the order, no publicity. The completion of Disneyland coincided with Walt and Lily's 30th wedding anniversary, and an invitation went to 300 people for the Tempest Fugit celebration. Where? Disneyland, where there's plenty of room. When? Wednesday, July 13th, 1955 at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Why? Because we've been married 30 years. How? By cruising down the Mississippi on the Mark Twain's maiden voyage, followed by dinner at Slewfoot Sue's Golden Horseshoe. Hope you can make it, and we especially want you, and by the way, no gifts, please. We have everything, including a grandson. Lily and Walt. The guests arrived in the warmth of the July evening and were transported in surreys past the glittering lights of Main Street, through the gates of Frontierland, and to the Slewfoot Sue's saloon for cocktails. One of the early arrivals was Joe Fowler, who visited the Mark Twain for a final inspection. He encountered a lady who handed him a broom and said, This ship is just filthy. Let's get busy and sweep it up. And so the former Admiral and Mrs. Walt Disney swept the sawdust and dirt from the deck of the Mark Twain in preparation for the guests. Walt had been working all day at the park, and he welcomed the chance to relax with his friends and co-workers and show off Disneyland to them. He led the crowd across Frontierland Square to the dock where the Mark Twain waited, all shiny and white and twinkling with old-fashioned electric bulbs that outlined the decks. A Dixieland band played brassy melodies, and waiters circulated with trays full of mint juleps as the paddle wheeler pulled away from the dock with a whistle blast. Walt strolled among the guests and basked in their delight as the Mark Twain eased around the bend and sailed past the darkened Tom Sawyer's Island. He felt the weariness of the long months of planning and building, and the elation of seeing his dream almost completed. Those feelings combined with the juleps to make him gloriously high. The party returned to the Golden Horseshoe for dinner and the Frontier Review with high-kicking chorus girls and some comic Wally Bogue playing an antic Pecos Bill. As Bogue began firing his blank pistols, Walt leaned over the balcony and fired back with his fingers pointed like a gun. His daughter Diane recalled what happened thereafter. People below started to notice him. There's Walt, they said. There was a little applause and general recognition from the audience. And with that, Daddy was off. He started to climb down the balcony, and every little bit of comment or applause would just keep him onward. At one point, it got a little touchy. I thought I was going to fall from the balcony, but he made it down to the stage. He just stood there and beamed. Everyone started saying, Speech! Speech! But there's no speech forthcoming. All he did was stand there and beam. Then everybody applauded and said, Lily! Lily! We want Lily! So Mother got on stage figuring, if I get up there, I can get Walt down. Well, that wasn't the case. So Mother dragged Sharon and me up on the stage, and still nothing happened. Dad was just planted there, and he was loving every minute. I guess someone must have sensed our plight, because the band started to play, and Edgar Bergen came on stage and started to dance with me, and some others came up and danced with Mother and Sharon. Everybody started dancing, and my father was gently elbowed into the wings. He was loving every minute of it, just grinning at people. Everyone was worried about Dad's driving home. They were trying to steal his car keys and everything, but I just said, Daddy, can I drive you home? He said, Well, sure, honey. No problem at all. He was meek and mild and willing. He just climbed in the back seat of the car. He had a map of Disneyland and he rolled it up and tooted in my ear as it was a toy trumpet. And before I knew it, all was silent. I looked around and there he was with his arms folded around the map like a boy with a toy trumpet, sound asleep. I know he didn't have too much to drink because the next morning he didn't have a hangover. He bounded out of the house at 7:30 and headed for Disneyland again. The hot July sun had barely risen as crowds began to gather for the grand opening of Disneyland. Within a few hours, every street within a 10-mile radius of the park was clogged with automobiles. The first day event was invitational. Tickets had been given to studio workers and those who had constructed the park, to press and dignitaries, and to suppliers and officials of companies sponsoring events. But there were many more who were uninvited. Tickets to the grand opening had been cleverly counterfeited. 33,000 people poured through the gates. Rides broke down after the first onslaught of customers. Restaurants and refreshment stands ran out of food and drink. A gas leak was detected in Fantasyland and the entire area was closed to the public. Tempers flared as the sun grew hotter. One of the young Disneyland workers retained three vivid memories of opening day. Women spiked heels sinking into the um, Women spiked heels sinking into the softened asphalt on Main Street, the Mark Twain steamboat with its decks awash because of too many passengers, parents tossing small children over the heads of the crowd to gain rides on the King Arthur carousel. Walt was spared the ordeal of watching the fiasco. He was being rushed from one part of the park to another for the making of a special television show. He didn't realize the failure of the opening until he read the press accounts the following day. Most of the reports were unfavorable, and one columnist accused Walt Disney of skimping on drinking fountains to promote the sale of soft drinks. Walt telephoned the columnist to explain, off the record, that the plumber strike had required him to decide whether toilets or drinking fountains would be installed first. People can buy Pepsi Cola, but they can't pee in the street, Walt said. Ever afterwards, Walt referred to the opening day as Black Sunday. Characteristically, he didn't dwell on the disappointment. He summoned his staff to deal with the pressing problems of increasing the capacity of the rides, handling the flow of people through the park, relieving the traffic jams in surrounded areas, serving food more expeditiously. He set about to repair press relations, inviting the staff of newspapers, magazines, and wire services to bring their families to Disneyland for special evenings. He appeared at each dinner to apologize for the inconveniences of opening day. He spent his days at Disneyland and often slept overnight in his apartment over the firehouse on Town Square. Night workers were sometimes startled to see Walt walking through the park in his bathrobe. Early one morning, he encountered two carpenters making repairs on a Main Street building. "Hey, I got the key to the Sunkist store. Come on over, we'll have a drink," he said. He unlocked the store, turned on the lights, and discussed carpentry with the two workers over a tall glass of orange juice. During the day, he walked through the park, observing the people and their reactions, asking questions of the ride attendants, waitresses, store clerks, janitors. From the beginning, he insisted on utter cleanliness. Remembering the tawdry carnivals he had visited with his daughters, he told his staff, "If you can keep a place clean, people will respect it. If you let it get dirty, they'll make it worse." He didn't want peanut shells strewn on the sidewalks, only shelled nuts were sold. No gum could be purchased inside the park. Young men strolled through the crowds, retrieving trash as soon as it was discarded. He never seemed to tire of striding through the park and watching the people and the reactions to Disneyland. "Look at them," he enthused to a company. "Did you ever see so many happy people? So many people just enjoying themselves." One day at twilight, a Disneyland engineer was strolling through Frontierland when he saw a solitary figure sitting on a bench. It was Walt Disney, severing the side of the Mark Twain, pulling around the bend with a puff of white steam. Thank you again for coming today. Your time is important to me. And remember, today's special moments make tomorrow's memories. Have a wonderful day.